Among myself and friends growing up in Dallas, camping wasn't something you did by choice. Why would you go out into the middle of nowhere and fight insects? The entire premise seemed ludicrous. It wouldn't be until I went off to college that I'd find out how fun it actually was. During my 4 years at North Texas, I would go from a die-hard city boy to borderline survivalist. Then, just like that, something occurred that has tainted my love of the woods to this day. As I said at the start, me and the outdoors never saw eye to eye. Before I moved to Denton, if there was a spider web, I'd always seem to run into it. If the mosquitoes were hungry, they'd pick me to feast on. You get the idea? Just by chance, I ended up rooming with this kid from around Nacogdoches. He'd grown up in the woods. A few of his friends from back home were attending North Texas with us. They would camp all around the state on our holiday breaks. As my first spring break approached, they invited me along to Lake Ray Roberts. If you don't know already, Ray Roberts is this famous lake near Denton. It's world famous for its bass fishing, among other things. I wasn't looking forward to hanging out in Dallas, and I didn't know any of the cool kids, the ones who were heading for one of the places on the coast. So, Ray Roberts it was. With no prior experience of camping, I had to rely on the suggestions of my companions. I borrowed, bargained, or improvised everything I needed. The only thing I didn't skimp on was bug spray. Deepwoods Off and I would become intimate friends. An amazing thing would take place on that trip. Since I'd bathed myself in bug spray, I was free to focus on the actual experience. Everything was going well, then I caught my first fish, and I was hooked, so to speak. The remainder of that trip was spent learning everything I could about the outdoors. After that adventure, I made myself a member of every trip for the next 2 years. I even got to see the ocean that following summer. When I wasn't in class or sleeping, I walked from one end of the town to the other. Despite being a university city, Denton still has that small town feel. There wasn't a tree or animal track I couldn't identify. During the warmer months, I'd spend as much time as possible practicing my newly acquired skill at the nearby Louisville Lake. I don't think my friends from East Texas knew half as much as I did after a while. My friends back in Dallas said they didn't recognize me anymore. I didn't care, though. I was determined to never be separated from nature again, and, in a way, I'm still deeply connected to it. But when it comes to stepping foot back in the woods, I may never be capable of that feat again. It was spring break by my final year. By now, some of my fellow campers had flunked out or transferred. 1 or 2 of the guys were still around, but we didn't keep in touch. I'd been planning a big trip to a well-known national forest in the eastern part of the state. I'd rather not say the name here. I fear my experience may turn some off from seeing the place themselves. It's truly beautiful, regardless of what shady things may be going on there. And before leaving, I'd been warned to watch out for overzealous hunters. This trip, however, wasn't going to take place during any hunting season that I knew of, so I felt relatively safe. After doing one last quick scan of my checklist, I threw my Jeep into drive and began the 3+ hour drive. I pulled into my camping area just after 3 p.m. and set up everything just the way I'd liked it. I decided to take a quick look around before dinner. This was the first time I noticed them. Well, I didn't actually see anyone, but the feeling I was being watched never left me. I cut my hike short and returned to camp. Although bears were not known to live in this area, I had read a few stories online, and the idea of being eaten my first day there sounded very uncool. I had dinner and hit the sack just after dark. Nothing out of the ordinary happened that night, as far as I know. The next morning was something out of a fantasy. The crisp, clean air was the best I'd ever inhaled. Breakfast was something quick and easy. I don't remember exactly what it was, and you'll soon see why. The beauty of the morning made me eager to explore. I threw a small day pack with all my emergency supplies and a little food and hit the trail. The next few hours were quiet. The occasional snapped twig or shuffling sound was heard, but I never got the feeling anyone but myself and the animals were present. Just after 11 a.m., I stopped for a snack. As I waited for my Trangia to heat up some water, I lounged lazily against a pine tree. I must have been dozing off when an especially brave mosquito plunged her mouth into my neck. I jerked awake and swatted the little pest into a red smudge. and this was when I caught sight of a flash in the distance. It wasn't more than a quick movement, and for a moment I questioned my eyes. However, the loud cawing of a crow soon after told me I wasn't alone. Although I wasn't scared yet, I wondered why someone would be watching me. I'm sure you can see how creepy that would be. Eventually, the crow moved away and I was left in peace to enjoy my coffee. I figured if my creepy stalker hadn't yet shown himself, he likely meant me no harm. I spent maybe another 10 minutes at that location before packing up and moving on. Another half hour or so passed, and it soon became obvious that my stalker was still with me. He didn't seem to know about staying quiet in the woods either. A constant, distant sound of shuffling leaves could be heard behind me. A strange smell began to drift from up ahead of me. I chopped to sniff the air and the woods went completely silent. A chill shot through me. Something wasn't right. My curiosity was getting the best of me, and against my instincts, I started walking in the direction of the smell. I made it about 3 steps before a puff of dirt and needles shot up next to me. Not a second later, a crack came from behind me. I turned to look for the source just in time for another crack. This was about the time I realized I was being shot at and hit the ground. I didn't dare move now. Frozen in place, I listened for any movement. The internet's warnings of overzealous hunters began echoing in my head. I figured if I yelled out, the shooter may realize his mistake and hold his fire. I did just that, but no answer came. I couldn't hear any movement and assumed that I was safe. The sounds of the forest slowly began to come back. This was the verification I needed. I was shook, but no worse for wear. I jumped back up to my feet and brushed myself off. The strange smell hit me again. For some reason, I hadn't learned my lesson yet and began walking toward it. And within about 5 steps, another quick series of shots came from the direction of the smell. I didn't think or reason. I just turned tail and ran back in the direction I'd come from. My only goal was to make it back to civilization alive. I prayed to God over and over, begging him to deliver me from this. 1 or 2 more shots rang out behind me, but I was too focused on escaping to see where they hit. My flight continued for at least 10 minutes. It wasn't until my body gave out that I stopped. Although I hadn't heard any shots for some time, I didn't dare remain where I was. I chugged a canteen full of water and continued my escape, but now at a much slower pace. Within an hour, I was back at my camp. I wanted nothing more than to get back to Denton as soon as possible. No time was wasted properly packing anything. I didn't even bother to make sure the fire was fully extinguished. A crime I would have never committed otherwise, as I had no intention of notifying the police. My biggest fear was that I'd be made to return to the scene of the crime. This very idea made me retch. Nonetheless, the further away I got from the national forest, the more guilty I started to feel. There was a very real possibility that another camper would bumble into whatever I had. I knew I'd never be able to live with the guilt of a preventable death on my conscience. About 20 miles from the national forest, I finally found a police station and made a report. The officer didn't seem very surprised at what he'd heard. He suggested the overzealous hunter theory, but after having some time to think about it, it didn't fit in my mind. Had the shooting stopped when I identified myself, it would make sense. The truth is, I had no idea what had happened. The officer promised me that they would check it out, and for a moment I thought he was going to ask me to show the officers the exact location, but he stopped mid-thought and thanked me for coming in. I had no faith the cops would find anything, let alone contact me if they did. To be honest, I didn't care. There was no way I was ever returning to that place. I must have looked like a big idiot, kissing the ground outside my house, but the relief I felt was immeasurable. A little time passed and things were starting to get back to normal. Despite the terrifying incident, I was fully intending to return to the woods, just not those woods. I stopped off at the 4chan/outboard and a particularly on-point post grabbed my attention. The OP had been hiking in an area he thought he knew well. Stories about massive pot fields being guarded by cartel members had been passed around for years, but he chalked them up to fear-mongering. Then, by chance, he stumbled onto one of those mythical growing patches. He hadn't heard or seen anyone around. He hoped he could slip away undetected. And no sooner had he begun backing away than gunfire opened up all around him. He was grazed on his cheek and side as he ran back toward his house, and the whole thing had him terrified. Too terrified to report, in fact. The story did seem a bit too convenient for me, but the seed had something fully planted into my psyche. I'd never once considered something like this to be possible in my instance. It didn't matter if it was true or not. The longer I stayed from the woods, the more real it became. After some point, I pretty much accepted my days in the woods were over. 9 years on, life is much like it was before I left for college. The only difference is I'm older and a lot more educated about the natural world. I catch myself occasionally staring out into the woods near my home and feel that call of the wild I once felt, but it'll never be as it once was. I'm well aware that the odds of something like that happening are minuscule. It's not fear that lies at the root of my avoidance, at least not all these years later. To be honest, now that I know things like that are going on in the woods, a place I still love so deeply, I can't see them quite as I once had. They've been tainted for me. The things that they do poison the forest and the wildlife that call it home. Their very existence has been seared into my mind forever. No, I'm content with my memories and pass on my knowledge to any who seek it. Instead, I prefer to remember things as they once were. Crisp, clean, beautiful. In the late spring of 2017, I embarked on my long-anticipated camping trip out west. The trip was almost 2 years in the planning stage and would be my first chance to camp with firearms. The journey to the location was an enjoyable experience, and I learned a lot about that part of our country I wasn't aware of. On arrival, I parked my truck and notified my contact that I'd arrived safe. We went over my agenda one last time, and I began the long hike to my campsite. Things went quietly that first day. The weather was so nice, I slept under the stars next to my fire. The freedom I felt was refreshing as opposed to all the restrictions we'd had back home. The following day was much like the one before. I walked at a leisurely pace and enjoyed all the wildlife around me. A bit after 1 p.m., I finally found the spot I'd hoped to camp. A quick scan told me that I'd made a wise decision. In no time, everything was set up and I was cooking my lunch. I could feel myself dozing off afterwards, so I took the opportunity to do some shooting. After all, this is why I was out here. Around 200 yards from camp, I found a dry creek bed. It looked to be the safest place to shoot. I set up a few steel targets and let lead fly. I can't describe the elation I felt. This must have been how the mountain men lived, I told myself. I'd gone through a box of 7.62 and was reloading my SKS when the sound of gunshots echoed through the hills around me. My curiosity drove me to check out their source. The shots continued as I searched. They sounded as if though they were coming from multiple guns, and this made me a bit nervous. I chose to return to camp, and something told me from the sound of the shots that I wouldn't be welcome, and it's a decision I still regret and thank myself to this day. Back at camp, I began considering what I'd have for dinner. The shooting had stopped soon after I'd returned. I assumed the shooters had moved on and the evening would be quiet. Once I finished cleaning my guns, which took me about an hour, I laid back and stared at the fire. I caught myself nodding off again, so rather than cook something big, I filled up on a sleeve of crackers and bacon-flavored easy cheese. The sun was beginning to slip behind the trees, and I took this as a sign to crawl off to bed for an early night. It was completely dark when a noise awakened me. I jolted up and peeked out of my tent. Nothing was there. I figured it was a dream and laid back down. Just as I closed my eyes, I heard it again. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the night. Next to hearing a rabbit being killed by a predator, it was the worst sound I'd ever heard. The screams came again, but this time was followed by a female voice screaming for help. Things got real in that moment. I felt a shiver through my body. What was I going to do? I briefly considered grabbing my rifle and running off into the dark. It was clear by now where the sounds were coming from, the same direction the shots had been coming from earlier. Common sense won out and I stayed where I was. One more scream for help came and was followed by a single gunshot, and I laid frozen in terror, wondering what to do until the sun rose the next morning. My feelings of freedom and power were gone now. I waited, minute after minute, for the dawn so I could escape the coming death I had convinced myself was coming. With the sunrise, my kit was packed in record time and I was on my way, back to a place I perceived as oppressive, or anywhere for that matter, anywhere but there. A trip which had taken me in a day and a half to make just a few days before took less than one to return from. It was a miracle I'd make it back at all. Every few minutes I'd turn around, rifle gripped tightly in my hand, looking for some imaginary pursuers. I arrived back in my truck just after dark and turned for home, never happier to be returning. After the relief began to wear off, the guilt began to set in. As far as I could tell, I had hurt a woman in need for help, being murdered perhaps, and I did nothing about it, not a thing. For the entire drive back, a war waged between my ego and common sense. One second I hated myself, calling myself a coward, and the next, you were obviously outnumbered. There's nothing you could do. The undeniable facts are that all those things are true. I was indeed a coward, scared as a child that sees his first horror movie, but at the same time, running out into the pitch dark after an unknown number of assailants would have been very, very stupid. Though it's still the sting in my ego I feel the strongest to this day. Any man could tell you why. Coward or hero, none of this amounted to much. The real question is if I was going to report what I'd witnessed. Witnessed? That was a word that would undo my great act of virtue. I really didn't witness anything. I heard a few screams and shots out in the middle of nowhere, hardly a groundbreaking indictment. Without any real evidence, I'd be no more than a nuisance to the cops, and that was it. And my punishment, it's been this unending shame of picking logic and reason over common decency. It would be some months until I would discover the facts that surrounded this incident, and for some time I was too terrified at what I would find. Nonetheless, a day came when I was finally able to summon the courage to seek out the truth, and it turned out to be a mixed bag somewhat. To be brief, I just happened to be camping a mile away from an outlaw biker gang. Earlier in that day, they had arrived at the site that they used in the past to shoot their less-than-legal firearms. Unfortunately, they had also abducted a female backpacker. After horribly abusing her for several hours, they set her free. She fled from their campsite. This must have been the screams that I heard for help, only to be shot and left for dead. Most of the time, this would be where the terrible story would end. However, by some act of God, the backpacker clung to life. Somehow she made her way back to the highway and found help. After a week in the hospital, she was released. The bikers knew that they were caught and took deals that will see most of them serving the remainder of their lives in prison. Although I was genuinely happy to hear the victim was alive, the thought of what-ifs haunt me to this day. I'd never told anyone about this incident. Choosing to use this throwaway account means I probably never will. If you end up reading this and thinking me as a low-life coward, I really don't blame you. I didn't tell this story for folks like you. Rather, this account is for those that believe it's the best policy to not get involved in others' problems. I understand now your desire to avoid conflict. Many have been punished for doing the right thing. You may end up as one of those people if you assist someone in need. Your life might be ruined because of it. I can tell you from first-hand experience that pales in comparison to the guilt you'll carry around for the rest of your life. It's simple. We're here on this earth together. If able, we should help our fellow human beings in need. Put yourself in your neighbor's shoes. You could be the only thing standing between them living or dying. Although this story is far from over, the majority of what I'll share occurred about 12 years ago. It's around 2009 and I'm still living with my folks. We've moved into the neighborhood when I was 13. Not long after I discovered the woods across the road, I was sort of forced into making the woods my sanctuary because of the bullying I experienced and all the turmoil at home. This neighborhood didn't have many kids living in it, and the few there were older, among other things. All the hostility made me a very nervous kid. Any free time I had was spent alone. I got curious one day and wandered into the woods. There didn't appear to be anyone but me out there, and this gave me a strange feeling of safety, something I'd not felt for a long time. I found this small circle of cedar trees that made a secret open area and made it my clubhouse of sorts. As time passed, I began spending more and more time in the trees. I even accidentally fell asleep and spent the night out there once, and I was sure my parents were going to freak out, but they hadn't even noticed. This was the only excuse I needed. I began camping in my clubhouse every once in a while at first. I wasn't missed a single time. I knew I was going to need some camping supplies now, though. I tried bringing things from home, but they wore out fast. Asking my parents for money was out of the question. I began going door to door and offering my services as a lawnmower. I'd never mowed a lawn in my life, but that wasn't important. The real problem was finding a lawnmower. I would sneak my dad's mower out and do a job, but eventually I was caught and actually caught a beating for it. Fortunately, I had enough money by then to buy a really terrible one of my own. It took all the money I'd saved, but it was a much safer way to make it. Once I managed to remake the money I'd lost, I hopped on my barely working bike and rode it to the 5 miles to this dinky army surplus place. I emerged with an Alice pack stuffed with various things that I thought I needed. I was so excited to try the stuff out. I skipped a whole week of school and camped out in my clubhouse. It was an addictive hobby, but something much more for me. It was the only source of safety and happiness I had. For the next however many years, I went to school just enough not to cause any trouble. I would go straight from school to my clubhouse every afternoon. By now, I'd come to see those woods as mine. Anybody in between would have been seen as an invader in my mind, and when that day came, I didn't think twice about striking back. It was a Sunday afternoon. I'd been camping out all weekend and was taking the well-worn path to the creek to get water. Across the creek, about 50 yards, was an almost deserted road. I rarely saw anyone use it. I caught sight of a parked camper. The 2 men walking in and out of it never seemed to notice me, and when I returned a few hours later, they were still there. Only now they were drinking beers and mindlessly shooting guns. This made me furious, but when a stray bullet actually struck the water just feet from me, I had had enough. I ran the mile back home and called the sheriff. I assumed my call was anonymous, but now I'm not so sure. I made up a story that I had gotten lost and drove up on the men. I lied and said they had threatened me with their guns. And I realize how wrong that is now, but I was young and angry. One morning as I prepared for school, I overheard a news report about a big meth lab bust. Acting on an anonymous tip, sheriff's deputies found 2 men shooting guns on a country road. Upon further investigation, the camper the men were driving turned out to be a mobile meth lab. The 2 men were taken into custody and were being held pending bail hearings, and I knew this had to have been the call I made. The seriousness of the situation scared me, but I was confident no one would know that it was me that had made the call. And for the next year, I even followed the case. About 3 months before their sentencing hearing, I received an unnamed letter in the mail, and it simply said, "You mess with the wrong people, kid." A jolt of ice-cold fear shot through me, but I still doubted it was from the 2 men. Any doubt I had was removed when another came the next week, this one far clearer. "You better pray we get time served." I was too terrified at the time to wonder how they knew that it was me. I'm still not sure how they identified me, but the how no longer mattered. The letters continued to arrive. When the day of the hearing came, the news was not good. Both men were felons found with multiple firearms. Adding on the manufacturing charge, and you get a minimum of 10 years. The judge was not feeling generous. He gave both of the men 20 years. I was sure my days on Earth were numbered. I stopped going to school and spent all my time in the woods. I wasn't foolish enough to think that it would keep me safe, but if I was going to die, I wanted to die somewhere I loved. A strange thing happened, though. The death I was expecting never came. Month after month, I became more confident that it all had been a joke or more than likely just an intimidation tactic. My life flew by, and this last 10 years has been a series of ups and downs. The meth heads have been the last thing on my mind. Then, last week, a new anonymous letter showed up at my apartment. You better write a will. The end is close at hand. I involuntarily dropped it like a hot potato. My girlfriend was with me and witnessed it. She picked up the letter and read it, and I could tell she was concerned, but I played it off as a prank and refused to explain. And just like that, a ghost from my past reappeared into the present. You can probably guess what this unwanted news had done to me. I feel like I'm constantly looking over my shoulder everywhere I go. I'm terrified these monsters may go after my girlfriend and newborn child. Going to the cops was a brief consideration, but without any proof of who the sender is, I know there's not much they can do. My options seem to be limited. Without anyone else to talk to, I'm anonymously emailing this in to tell my story. I'm not sure why. It could be because of the anonymity of the internet. There's not much more I can say other than to tell you all to be careful of the choices you make as a child. Wish me luck, and please pray for me and my family. This is an experience my wife and I just had this past year. As soon as the quarantine was lifted in our area, she and I filled our packs and went for a hike at our local state park. It was something we used to do pretty regularly and have since before we got married. Speaking for myself, I was really looking forward to it. The plan was to hike out to a certain lake, spend the night, and hike back to the car. It was a clear, warm day and the trails were nice and dry. For most of that morning, we had been the only people on the trail. We decided to stop for lunch at a campsite about halfway to the lake. Another couple must have had the same idea. They were sitting at the concrete picnic table and we asked to join them. Soon, the four of us were discussing what we had seen and where we were headed. The couple turned out to be newlyweds on their honeymoon. My wife, who's a hopeless romantic, loved to hear this. She proceeded to tell them how we'd met and some other sappy stuff I don't bother to remember. 2 hours passed and we finally said our goodbyes. We arrived at the lake about an hour before dark, tired and hungry. I got a fire started and Mandy, my wife, cooked us a small meal while I pitched the tent. We sat around the fire cooking s'mores and eventually called it a night at around 10 p.m. I got up just before dawn the next morning and got the fire ready to make the breakfast. We repeated our roles from the night prior, except I pulled the tent down and repacked it. All the measures were taken to ensure the fire was completely out after cooking, and with that, we took to the trail for the return journey. At 10 a.m., we reached the halfway point but chose not to stop. 2 hours up the trail, we ran into the husband of the couple we'd met the day before. Strangely, his wife wasn't with him. Mandy asked him about her location, and the man said that she'd become ill the night before and returned home. When he said it, he looked nervous and couldn't look either of us in the eyes. Before either of us could ask anything else, he said that his wife had insisted he finish the trip alone. It sounded a bit strange, but we had no reason not to believe him. A group of people came walking up about that same time, and the husband excused himself to talk to them. I wasn't interested in prying any further. Their marriage was none of my business, I thought. Mandy looked like she wanted to stay, but I reminded her of the obligations we had that night. She reluctantly agreed and we went on our way. We got to the parking lot not too long after and packed up our stuff. There were a few groups of people talking amongst themselves. As we pulled out of the lot, several more cars, including a ranger's truck, were pulling in. Once again, I thought nothing of it. We made it back home that afternoon and handled some family things. It wasn't until breakfast that we heard the news. I had grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down in front of the TV. I flipped it on just in time to receive a report of a dead female camper. When they showed her face on the screen, I almost choked on my coffee. It was a picture of the woman we had met just 2 days prior. I yelled out to Mandy to join me in the living room. I wanted to be sure of what I was seeing. I didn't have my glasses on at the time, and I pointed at the TV and asked, "Isn't that one of the newlyweds we met at the park?" She watched for a moment and let out a shocked gasp. Just then, a wedding photo of the couple appeared on the screen. Mandy grabbed the remote from my hand and turned up the volume. According to the husband, the couple had been at a cliffside that was a popular lookout. Mandy and I had been there once or twice ourselves in the past. They had watched the sun rise, and as they were preparing to turn and leave, the wife lost her footing and fell several hundred feet to the ground below. It was certainly possible, but something bothered me about it. Why hadn't he mentioned this to us? More so, what was up with the illness story? It couldn't have been more than a few hours after the incident had occurred. None of his behavior made any sense. I know if something such as that happened to me, I'd have been a mess. We had passed at least 15 people that morning and not a soul talked to us. It all seemed fishy to me. I was glad to see that Mandy agreed with me. It looked as if though her instincts had been right once again. Just don't tell her I said that. After a long discussion about our responsibilities and the like, we agreed that we should contact the law enforcement involved in the case. And as it stood, the husband isn't under any suspicion. Not publicly, anyways. I contacted the sheriff's office and told them what we knew. The deputy put us on hold for a moment, and when he returned, he said someone may reach out to us in the future. But it's been almost a year and no one has contacted us. And this is what brings me to emailing you here. What do you think? My instincts and my wife's tell us that a crime may have occurred. We, however, have no proof or any real justification for our feelings. And that's just what they are, feelings. Certainly if law enforcement believed we had something to offer, they would have already contacted us, right? I don't want to be a nuisance, nor do I want to cause trouble for a grieving man who by all appearances is a decent person. But help me out here. Should I keep pushing or leave the police to do their jobs? I just can't shake this nagging feeling that a man is getting away with cold-blooded murder. My childhood was anything but stable. After divorcing my father, my mom dated a long string of losers. She even moved a few in, and around 14, she married a guy named Frank that she had met in the bar that she worked at. Frank was an outright a-hole and tried in vain to usurp my father's role. Mom had done her best to keep Dad and I apart, but I knew the whole time he loved and wanted to be with me. Prior to the divorce, he and I would hunt, fish, and camp regularly. This instilled a love for the outdoors I'll never shake, nor would I want to. This made my decision to live in the woods almost a no-brainer. I was 17 when I couldn't take Frank's tyranny anymore. Despite being an unemployed bum for most of the time, he expected me to wake up by 8 a.m. every day. Unlike him, I worked 5 days a week. I've been saving to get my own place since my junior year. Getting away from him and my mom were high on my priorities list. So much so I quit school at the end of my first semester and got my GED. Dad wasn't happy to hear about it, but he signed the waiver because he understood. On my days off, I felt I'd earned the right to sleep in. Frank disagreed for some reason. I'd felt a lot of pressure at work at the time. When Frank came in yelling for me to wake up, I told him to F off. He drew back like he was going to hit me, and I reacted by knocking him to the floor. This was the breaking point. I knew that little wimp would call the cops, so I packed my backpack as fast as I could and hit the road, and I've never lived there again. With no clear plan or car, I roamed aimlessly for most of the day. As the sun began to fall, I slipped off into a patch of woods on the edge of town. I walked in far enough to not be seen from the road and made camp. I threw together a fire and fashioned a bed from clothes and leaves. That night was surprisingly comfortable, but I had no intent on making it a long-term thing. In my arrogant mind, I'd have no trouble finding an abandoned place to sleep until I'd saved enough. It didn't turn out to be that easy. Most places anywhere decent enough had security. The one spot that didn't was controlled by a gang. They used it as a shooting gallery, I felt like. The floor was an inch deep in old needles. Life with Frank was preferable to that. Another weekend was coming to an end. Sleep and safety were on my top priorities, so I returned to my forest camp and did the best with what I had. Sleeping on the ground wasn't going to work for the long term. The middle of that first week, I walked to a Walmart after work and grabbed a few things, a sleeping bag most importantly. A little time investment made my sleeping arrangements a lot better. I also made a simple lean-to structure from a tarp and lined it with foil. The foil reflected the heat from the fire back down onto my body, making the cooler nights much less so. For a long time, I would clean up the best I could in public bathrooms. My clothes were cleaned at our 24-hour laundromat. It wasn't uncommon for me to spend the night there on laundry days. My hygiene did manage to draw a little attention from my bosses, but none ever said anything. And I did eventually find a fork of river that ran near my camp. I'd bathe there as often as I could. Overall, my time there was a lot better than it could have been had I not had a job. Employed or not everything was idealistic as I made it sound. My little patch of woods was bisected by railroad tracks. With railroad tracks come hobos. And about half a mile from my camp and across the track lay the hobos' camp. It wasn't really much more than an overnight place for most of those guys. I first stumbled upon it by chance. I used the tracks as a quiet pathway back and forth each day. If the police saw you walking alongside the busier roads, they'd harass you. This isn't something I wanted or needed. I was still technically a minor after all. One evening, as I returned to my campsite, the glow of a fire reflecting off the leaves caught my sight. I walked toward it and began to hear a group of men talking. I carefully peeked down the hill and saw 3 older men hunched around the fire. I just watched and listened for a few minutes. Eventually, I realized they weren't anyone to worry about and called down to them. They looked up and huddled together. They must have decided I wasn't a threat either. They called me down to join them. At first, I just sat there and listened to their stories, but after some time, they asked me my name and where I was headed. I thought for a minute, before just making up that my name was Frank and I lived nearby. This spurred an hours-long conversation about all types of things. I learned about a life of riding the rails, and I told them a little about my situation. At some point that night, I got to taste fortified wine for the first time. It's not something I'd recommend, but I came to form quite an affinity for it. Nothing exciting would happen that night, and not for a long time. It was with the approach of fall that seemed to bring with it the cold wind, obviously, but not to mention a few ill-mannered hobos, too. By this point, I'd almost come to be one of the train-hopping fraternity. The few regulars and I had spent many a cool evening by the fire, listening to the newcomers' stories and passing around a bottle or two. One of those passing through was an older guy called Tampa. He was quiet at first, but became more belligerent the more intoxicated he became. I'm not sure what I said, but something set him off and he took a swing at me. Before I knew it, I was on the ground being kicked. The other guys got him to stop long enough for me to get away, and after that night I made sure to keep my distance when someone I didn't know was around. This rule served me well until I allowed myself to be tricked by someone that I thought I knew. The second incident is what ultimately led me finally getting my own apartment earlier than I had planned. The run-in with Tampa was fading from my mind. Other more important things like staying warm and fed were occupying most of my thoughts. Somehow, despite being a homeless teenager, I managed to get a promotion at work. I may have allowed them to believe that I quit school to invest more time there. True or not, the promotion brought with it a raise. I'd been spending most of my money just trying to stay alive. Now, living would be a lot easier. And I was gathering wood one Saturday and noticed a guy about my age walking toward me with a backpack. Although leery, he seemed normal enough to me. He had just come from a Kansas City, I forgot to ask which one, and he told me his name was Dallas. We began talking and I told him about the camp. He thanked me and went our separate ways. Later that night, we continued our conversation around the fire as a bottle made its way among us. For the next 2 days, I spent my evenings with Dallas and the rest of the guys listening to their amazing tales of riding the rails. All seemed well until that second evening. Earlier that day, I'd made a slip-up and mentioned it was payday. I'd always been cagey when it came to how much money I made. A few of the guys knew I had a steady job, but even with them, I never let them see me with more than a few dollars. Since my earliest days, I'd had caches where I'd hide most of my money. I made sure to constantly move it at irregular times and intervals. Being paranoid was preferable to being robbed. That evening, Dallas and I were discussing a private matter. I hadn't taken the time to stash my money before I left camp, and Dallas seemed to have known it. I realized now that he had been spending his days searching for my current cash. When he couldn't find it, I guess he assumed I was carrying it on me. During our conversation, he asked if he could borrow some money. I told him I had given all I had to pay for the bottle we just had. He called me a liar and produced a long pocket knife. Obviously, I was terrified. Nonetheless, losing almost $1,000 must have scared me more. I held on to the lie as long as I could, but the fear overtook me and I started begging. His face had changed to a look of pure evil. I knew he had no problem killing me. My flight response kicked in and was going to run, and just as I began to turn, Dallas took a wide swipe at me. I was out of range for the cut to be too bad, but I was slashed across my left arm regardless. I was now too scared to turn away, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. I began jogging backward up the hill, watching Dallas the whole time. I'd taken about 5 steps and watched as he folded up and collapsed. It didn't make any sense until I made out the shape of another person standing behind him with something long in his hand. I called out and Johnny, one of the regulars, stepped up into the dim light. Johnny was holding his trademark axe handle. I thanked him and he proceeded to tell me he had been watching Dallas all evening. While he and a few others had been in the liquor store, Dallas had made an offhanded comment about me being Mr. Moneybags. He figured Dallas had something planned. Dallas was beginning to stir by now and cursing Johnny. Johnny simply looked down at him and said, "Get," and added that if he didn't, he would get an even worse beating. Dallas did as he's told and disappeared into the night, hopefully forever. And for safety's sake, I spent that night and a few more after at the hobo camp. I made sure to take a different path to and from work for the rest of the week. I didn't see Dallas again, but my second assault in less than a year was too much for me. I had had enough to get a place by this point anyhow. I was hoping to have a little more, but that seems to always be the case in life, right? I spent that weekend at the library, going over classifieds on Craigslist, and late that Sunday evening I was sleeping in my very own apartment. It was a tiny little dump, but it was mine. A few months later, I found a better, more permanent situation and spent a full 3 years there. I still think about Johnny and the other guys from time to time. They were nothing like you'd expect people in that life to be, but even being surrounded by a group of good guys like that, camping or sleeping rough as some call it, isn't something I'd recommend to anyone. The story takes place in the summer of 2004. I've been hiking the trails of a local state park for the last few years. The hour-long trip to the park went as smoothly as it had before. I parked near the ranger station and notified him of my plans. One last-minute check of my pack and I began my 2-mile hike to my regular campsite. Little did I know, at that moment, one person's life had just taken a grim turn and I was soon to follow. My interest in the outdoors started just after the attacks of September 11th. Although not personally present at any of the attack targets, I did lose someone very close to me. Her and I had been sweethearts in college but lost touch. The internet allowed us to be reconnected. We were planning on meeting for Thanksgiving and had been discussing the renewal of our relationship. I was beyond distraught upon getting the news and immediately began planning my own death. I got as far as packing a bag and hiking out to the spot. Something happened when I got there, though. The beauty of the place overcame me. Despite the utter grief I felt, the serenity I found on that mountain changed my mind. My grieving process would continue for some time. At any point I felt too overwhelmed, I fled back into nature and all was made bearable again. So now we're back in the summer of 2004. By now, my retreats were a regular thing. Nothing of note occurred that first evening. The next day I considered my options and chose to hike down into the canyons. These excursions often yielded a few stone points for my ever-growing collection. I knocked back some oatmeal and took to the trail. Almost halfway down the cliffside, a glint of light caught my eye. I couldn't locate the source. Soon another flash blinded me. I quickly recovered and caught sight of a pair of arms flailing about around 50 feet further down the cliffside. I jogged further down the trail to get a better view. There was a rocky outcrop off to the side that I jumped onto. I could instantly feel it beginning to give way under my feet. The fall felt like an eternity. I gritted my teeth in preparation for severe pain, but it wasn't as bad as I'd feared. Surveying my position from the flat of my back, I saw that I'd only gone about 20 feet. I rested there for a moment or two until I remembered what had brought me here. I tried to stand only to realize my left foot was wedged between two large rocks. I pushed on the top rock and simultaneously pulled my leg. I got just enough space to drag my leg free. I returned to my feet and looked around for the rest of the person I'd seen. I saw a woman laying almost motionless off to my right. I carefully stepped down the cliffside until I reached her, and she looked dead initially, but her lips began moving. And I kneeled down to her and began speaking. Calmly, I asked her name. Her eyes slowly opened and a smile grew on her face. "I thought you were dead when I saw that rock collapsed." A scratchy yet kind voice addressed me. "I don't mean to be rude, mister, but you wouldn't happen to have any water, would you?" I hastily dug through my pack for my Nalgene. The bottle was a little dented but showed no leaks. Slowly and carefully I placed the opening to her lips and poured a small amount in. I knew she may vomit if I gave her too much at once. For the next few minutes we spoke about how she ended up there. I would occasionally pour a little more water into her mouth. She was obviously in a great deal of pain, and I knew the longer I wasted talking, the longer she was from medical help. I told her of my plan and covered her with a fleece from my pack. Climbing back up the loose rocky hill was harder than coming down. I was beginning to feel a lot of pain myself, especially in my back. At first I attempted a hobbling type of run, but my knees wouldn't allow it. Instead I settled on a fast walk. The journey was long and painful, but I reached the ranger's post at just after 12:45 p.m. To his credit, he had a rescue team assembled within minutes. I had to settle for an ambulance ride and an overnight stay in the hospital. I think it was almost 6 p.m. when I saw the ER staff rolling her in. And the wait wasn't over, unfortunately. She'd been taken into emergency surgery soon after arriving, and several hours would pass until I'd heard anything, but when the news arrived, it was good. In spite of having a punctured lung, a concussion, a broken arm, and assorted other injuries, she would go on to make a full recovery. My path to healing is a story for another time, but Shannon was her name, did reunite with her loving family and go on to start one of her own. Last I heard, she was living in Colorado with her husband and 3 sons. And I hope everyone will join me in wishing her a long and happy life. I'm just happy I could be there to help her through all that she suffered. When I was a kid, I always wanted to be a Boy Scout. In this time, it was still a respected group teaching useful outdoor skills. I think I was 10 when I finally convinced my mom to let me join. She was hesitant at first. Back in Russia, where she had grown up, Scout-type groups were really nothing more than military training for children. I asked the den mother to talk to my mom, and after a long string of questions, her fears were put to rest. With that one roadblock removed, I became a Cub Scout. Unfortunately, I soon found scouting in my area was nothing like it was supposed to be. Our den mother turned out to be a neurotic single mother with little motivation. It was a major letdown for me. 6 months in, a small light of hope appeared on the horizon. A scout leader from a county over invited our den on a camping trip with us. This had been a big reason for my joining. I love camping with my family, but since my parents separated, all those trips had stopped. The scout leader picked us up early on a Saturday morning and drove us all to the campsite. There weren't a lot there, maybe 9 kids in total. He gathered us all together and gave an instruction on setting up our tents. Each tent held 2 boys, but because of the odd number, I got a tent to myself. One by one, the leader showed us where to go and we began pitching. A few needed help, but the experience went smoothly for the most part. The rest of the morning was spent on first aid and general safety. I was paired with the leader, thus became the visual aid. For the next few hours, I was wrapped in bandages and carried on a makeshift litter. It was fun and proved useful in circumstances to come. With first aid completed, lunch was made and we were all allowed to take a little siesta. This lasted until about 3 when we were all brought together for archery lessons. I was psyched beyond belief. Ever since I saw my first ninja movie, I'd fantasized about shooting a bow. This is my first and last chance for a long while. The leader gave us a brief instruction on how to shoot. He was naturally very persistent about safety, but you can imagine a bunch of hyped-up preteen boys weren't really paying much attention to that part. I was the first to shoot. As I drew back the string, I can remember squatting down like a ninja. I was scolded for this and made to stand upright. This made the experience a bit less exciting, but seeing the arrow hit where I'd been aiming was exhilarating. The rest of the boys went in turn after me. Only then were we allowed to shoot on our own. Everyone was chattering amongst themselves, trying to outshoot the kid next to him. And then it happened. A kid named Kevin was talking to another boy next to him named Chris. Kevin had the arrow knocked and the string pulled back about a quarter of a full draw when Chris said something that caused Kevin to turn toward him. Kevin must have lost grip on the string, or maybe he let go and lied his way out of it later. Either way, the arrow hit Chris in the chest and penetrated about 8 inches. Panic ensued. The scout leader began yelling out for the first aid supplies. Chris was freaking out and already having a hard time breathing. There really wasn't much the scout leader could do but pack the area around the wound and try to keep Chris calm. 2 boys were given the task of running the half-mile to the ranger station, and the rest of us just stood around and stared silently. All except for Kevin, of course. He paced around saying "I'm sorry" over and over until the scout leader told him to shut up. The ambulance arrived around 20 minutes later. Probably the longest 20 minutes of my young life. And this was the end of the trip. Everyone packed up their stuff as quickly as possible and we all returned home. During the ride home, the seriousness of the situation must have hit Kevin hard. I can still remember his horrible wailing to this day. In my opinion, it was nothing more than a terrible accident. There are a few others, however, who remember things differently. According to one boy, Chris had called Kevin a name no boy our age wanted to be called, and Kevin shot him for it. Only Kevin knows the truth, and he's never spoken to anyone about it. News of Chris's condition didn't reach me until the following morning. He had been rushed into surgery, and it had gone well. The arrow had punctured Chris's left lung, just missing his heart by an inch. He did manage a full recovery. Kevin was probably the happiest to hear this news. All involved agreed it had been an unfortunate accident and no charges were brought against him. And a few months later, the 2 boys had a meeting in which Kevin formally apologized to Chris. And from what I hear, Chris did accept. As far as I know, he's never held a grudge. Not even I got away completely unscathed. The second my mom heard about that incident, my scouting days were over. I wasn't too disappointed, though. Instead, I got into BMX, and I guess that turned out to be a far safer experience. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you get a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your stories featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, and click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and huge compilations and save on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.